I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Good morning, one and all, and this is From the Fringes, Families for Justice. The opinions voiced on this show are our own opinions. My name's Jack Gielan. My guest host today on the show is Marius Ruckerus and also Steve Evans. Okay, Marius, are you there?
I'm here. I'm talking from Norway. Hi, how are you?
Right, very good. Okay, we've got this global protest against family splitting policies that is happening here on December the 7th. And we want to join Nordic Association for Parents and Children placed into care and supporters of their cause. Now, you've received a laureate from the Nordic Committee, is that right?
Yes, I was awarded this prize back in September 2018, which was a great tribute for me and for the people who are actually trying to do something about this very critical situation in the Scandinavian countries, absolutely.
Right, and you vow to continue your fight against Norway's punitive and unfair child protection programs.
Yes, indeed. Of course, I'm very encouraged by the news coming from the European Court of Human Rights, proving that me and the people who are working along with me, we're doing the right thing, because we have now a record high number of cases pending in the European Court, as well as we have a huge victory in the Grand Chamber in September, where Norway was convicted for violating Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. So, of course, this is very inspiring, and it also encourages me to continue to work hard on these issues, absolutely.
Now, Marius, it's Steve here. Now, I think just for the listeners, we need to explain something to the listeners, right? You took the Norwegian government to court, but you took the equivalent of what we call Oranga Tamariki in New Zealand, which you would call, or in general the globe calls, child protection system, the government child protection system. So can you please explain to our listeners the differentiation between the government and the child protection system, which we call Oranga Tamariki? You've got another name for them. In Norway, we've had about 10 name changes here.
We have a word that has become internationally known as the Barnevernet, which is the so-called Child Protective Service System in Norway, and this system has a lot of power in particular in Norway, because it can bring out children from families without any court orders, which is very unusual even in a worldwide perspective.
Wow.
So,
now, what we want to explain there to our listeners is what Marius is explaining is without notice applications. So in New Zealand, they can remove the children on a without notice application basis, which is, in general terms, arbitrary detention, which is a breach of our human rights. Is that correct, Marius? Is that how you see it?
Well, that was a good description. It's a clear violation of the so-called rule of law, which is an international standard. And when you are violating the rule of law, you are obviously also violating the human rights. So this is something that has caught a lot of attention in the European Court of Human Rights, because it's obvious that it's very, very controversial to what you self consider to be arbitrary detention. And I agree with you on that word. That's what it is, and it's obviously a violation without any control mechanism under the rule of law. So that's basically one of the most severe issues that we're dealing with also in Norway these days.
Right. So you're talking about Article 8, which speaks of protection of private and family life. And the judges seem to have a double role, serving European Council and Norwegian government. So the judges are serving the state, aren't they?
That's a very good question, and a very important question. I think that in Norway we have some call it the last last communist regime in Europe, where the state has tremendous power. And that one of the other problems is that Norway is, of course, a very financially rich country, but where the government is pretty much in control of the wealth, so that the government puts tremendous amounts of money. I mean, we're talking about almost 4 billion euros per year into this child welfare system, which is, of course, it generates a lot of money and it makes privileges to a lot of people working in the system. That makes the system very lucrative for a lot of people. But in order to maintain the system, you definitely have to take a lot of children away from their families.
Right. I think, Marius, we need to bring our listeners up to speed here. Right. Norway is a population of 5 million. New Zealand's a population of 4. We have an indigenous people of our country. They make up about 16 to 20% of the population. Depends who you speak to. But the point I think that we need to clarify with you is that you spend 4 billion euros on child protection. We spend 500 million New Zealand dollars, which is about 250 million euros. And that's how bad it is here. We like you have a very, very high suicide rate.
Yep.
Which is one of the biggest concerns for us. We lose more people to suicide in New Zealand than we do in car accidents.
And through the family law court system here in New Zealand, about how many a month commit suicide a year here?
Oh, it's
about 600 a year overall, but half of them would probably be related to the family court system.
And a lot of it's not documented clearly here in New Zealand either, because people die from heart attacks or medical issues brought around by the stress of the cases. But to go back a little bit further on the most important point that you were making was, is the judges operating independently of the state if they're not looking after the best interests of the children, which is a human right? Why would the state continue to support and allow judges to be able to operate independent and not be independent of the judiciary? And why would the judiciary be protecting employees of the state? They may well be operating with a criminal intent.
Well, first of all, it's obvious that in Norway, even though they're supposed to be independent, the judiciary in Norway is not independent, as it's governed more or less by the state. Second of all, it's obvious, and these are not my words, that the judges in Norway are obviously protecting not the best interest of the child, but the best interest of the state. Meaning that as long as the local child protective service system files a claim to the court, it's asking for a child to be brought out of his or her family. It is very obvious that the favor in the government's interests are incredibly high in Norway. Actually, in more cases, close more than 90% in favor of the government. So if you look upon the statistics, you see that the government is a very, the judiciary in Norway is very, very closely linked to the government services.
So here's
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so would you considering that we are allegedly, and you too, are a democracy, right? We vote the politicians in.
Yes.
We agree that they can set the laws. We will follow as long as we're ruled justly and fairly. But if the politicians and the bureaucrats are protecting the behavior of some of these people within the state to protect the state, wouldn't that be seen as a crime against humanity?
Yes, it's obviously, we're talking about very close borders to the crimes against humanity, but it's very obvious when the European Court of Human Rights, which has jurisdiction of more than almost 800 million people in Europe, are dealing with a record high number of child welfare cases against a small country like Norway with only 5 million people. It's obvious that they consider this to be a systematic crisis, not like an individual crisis, but a systematic crisis within the system. And when you are dealing with such serious cases as the European Court is in these cases, we are very close to the pattern of what you can call crimes against humanity, which means that if the European Court will continue to present cases against Norway, it's very obvious that we can start to raise these cases also to the International Criminal Court in Hague, which has jurisdiction to pursue cases that is definitely going towards persecution of minority groups, to put it that way. So I think that we have a lot of common interests in New Zealand and Norway, and the fact that the government is actually persecuting or following minority groups in somehow and to deprive them of fundamental rights. They always target the weak ones in a way. So this is interesting because I'm actually working on that now. I've already established contact with the ICC, the International Criminal Court in Hague, and I have alerted the court about what's going on in the European Court. And of course, this is very interesting for them as well, because the next step will probably be to, for the first time in history, to bring Norway to the ICC because of these huge human rights crimes.
So we're finding in New Zealand here, I've been fighting family law policy now for 20 years. The suicide rate has gone through the roof, and a lot of the children that are uplifted, the judges are just going on hearsay. The social workers are not doing right assessments. So we have a major problem in this country with judges not being answerable to the people. So we want to know what is the next stage of action. So we really need to take a court case to the Universal Human Rights Tribunal. This is what we want to do in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think that's what we have to do here as well, because you see the same thing here. I mean, the suicidal rate is going through the roof here as well. I think we might even have higher suicide rates than what you have in New Zealand without being certain about it. But even though
we're both at the top,
alarmingly high. Yeah, we're both at the top, and it's obvious that this cannot longer continue. So even though we have the European Court, I think we have to address this even to the next level, which is the ICC, the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, well, the biggest problem we've got in New Zealand is that the people who are in authority are definitely not listening. They just think we're a bunch of flakes. And the reality is that we know, and we have more and more evidence every day, that the rule of law is not being applied, that they're using their personal opinion because it's in law. It says that the judges can, and they're never ever holding the abuses conducted by the child protection system, the New Zealand police, which operate as the enforcers, or the lawyers that are there extenuating the conflict to account. And the New Zealanders have had enough. They really are had enough.
And you're saying, Steve, that the problem is the system, the Oranga Tamariki, the government's laws, and they're basically not listening to families, and it seems to be an attack on the biological family. That's what you're saying, Steve.
Well, they're not listening to citizens in general, and they're doing this deliberately. And it cannot continue to go on, because New Zealand has become a very, very unhappy place in the last 15 to 20 years.
Now, Maurice, do you think this is done on purpose? The attack on the family, the biological family? I mean, the extended family is accepted, but is this done on purpose at a higher level?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I listen to Steve, he could have talked about Norway. You know, it's so fascinating to hear him speak about this, because it's exactly what he could have said being here in Norway. So that's interesting. So my answer after working on these cases for a long time now is that, yes, I do believe that this is done on purpose. I do believe that this has to do with a tremendous finances coming into the system. And I do believe that this is a system that needs to maintain a very high degree of child welfare or child care take orders from the government in order to satisfy all these people who profit from the system. So when you ask me that question, I will be frank and say that I think it's done deliberately in one way. And then the court is actually, the European Court, I mean, keep in mind that we won in the Grand Chamber in Europe only a little more than a month ago. And the Grand Chamber is the highest court in Europe. And even the Grand Chamber considered the Norwegian system to be, and they use the word cynical. So that says a lot. When even the highest court in Europe considers the Norwegian system to be cynical, obviously that this is done with purpose and obviously.
Well, we agree with you.
That's how
we agree with you, Marius. We say it's all about the money, and it's not about the children.
Money is, of course. Yeah, and of course, that makes me unpopular among the elite in Norway, of course.
Nelson Mandela was a terrorist before he became the most wanted president in the world to be spoken to.
Yeah, so this is that's obviously.
So, Marius, I guess one of the things that we're looking at doing is we'd like to, as a group of people, we'd like to invite you out to New Zealand.
Yes, I've got venues lined up.
So that we can get you to speak more openly to more grassroots New Zealanders and professionals that are trying to get the courts in New Zealand and the judiciary to clean up their act with regards to human rights, because we're going to continue protesting outside judges' houses in the near future, which we can do legally under Brooker versus New Zealand Police Supreme Court of Appeal, because we're just tired of the lawless corruption that's going on in our judicial system throughout New Zealand.
And we've got this global protest against family splitting policies happening on the 7th of December. We'll be linking up with all the different countries of the world: Norway, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Austria, Denmark, Hawaii, Spain and Germany. So it's an international movement. I'd like to thank you for coming on the radio show, Maurice. So we'll be in contact with you about you coming to New Zealand.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to come to New Zealand, and that will be a win-win situation where that obviously will also put a lot of more pressure upon Norway as well. So this will be hopefully
an international movement.
Well, we may be a small country, Morris, but I tell you what, New Zealanders know how to put up a fight. And this is a fight for our lives and for our children. So if you need us in Norway, you just call us and then the Kiwi wagon will arrive.
Yeah. Thanks again, Maurice, for coming on the show. Thank you, and all the best.
Thank you for having me, and we'll talk soon. All the best to you too.
Radio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Once upon a time, a politician named Sue had an anti-smacking bill she pushed right through. They had a referendum to see what we thought, and 87% of us they ignored. Why won't they listen? Why don't they listen? The MPs are us off again. They have a referendum, but they have their own agenda. It's not how democracy's meant to work. We elect them into power, then they're in their ivory tower. They don't give a toss that we never get heard. It works in Switzerland and some of the states. They have a referendum and listen to their mates. The referendum's binding, so it becomes law. And that's what referendum should be for. Why won't they listen? Why don't they listen? The MPs are us off again. We elect them into power, then they're in their ivory tower, and they don't give a toss that we never get heard. It's not democratic, it's completely bureaucratic. They're meant to work for us, it's really quite absurd. So why are we abiding? The government needs reminding that referendum should be binding. No matter which political party's in power, they're all the same once they're in the ivory tower. They're meant to represent us, but we don't have a voice. They think they know best, so there's no bloody choice. Why won't they listen? Why don't they listen? The MPs are soft again. They have a referendum, but they have their own agenda, and they don't give a toss that we never get heard. It's not democratic, it's completely bureaucratic. They're meant to work for us, it's really quiet.
Okay, so we've been talking to the international human rights lawyer by the name of Marius Ruckerus, and we have this global protest against family splitting policies happening on December the 7th. That was very interesting, talking to him about being a human rights defender in New Zealand. So you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, Steve?
Well, the problem that he was, and I also spoke to Dr. Tony Ellis before we came on here, and Dr. Tony Ellis is a New Zealand human rights lawyer.
Yep.
And he's actually recognised by the University of Oslo. But one of the things that is pretty clear in New Zealand, that if you're a stand-up defender, human rights defender in law,
yep,
you're obviously going to be attacked. I mean, we know about the Russian lawyer Eugene Orlov, who's now living in Panama, and Frank Dulu, who they all got pretty much run out of New Zealand because they stood up to these judges on the grounds of human rights.
Yeah.
And
so they're a law unto themselves, the law courts here and the organisations.
Well, that would seem that way. And it would seem that they are protecting the state.
And you were saying before that we don't have an enforced constitution and we don't have human rights that have teeth, you're saying.
No, what we're saying here is that we've signed all these declarations of human rights, the UN political and civil rights, the children's rights.
Yep.
But when you actually go through and compare those declarations, a lot of it hasn't been ratified into law.
Right.
Now, why are the delays going on here?
Right.
And that's what we need to know. We need to know, and the reason that these, at least in my view, haven't been ratified into law, even though we've signed them, moons ago, is because it's in the interests of the state and the judiciary not to make them law. Now, if that's the case, then the legislators, and who's writing a lot of this legislation?
Right.
Crown law.
Crown law.
Now, so if they are not doing their jobs,
and
protecting the state and not us citizens, which is what's been going on in New Zealand for some time now. I mean, every system that we've got to complain about the state is just being watered down into weak piss.
Yeah, they haven't taken any notice, so we need some higher authority, and the judges are answerable to the state. Very interesting, he was paralleling Norway with New Zealand, or we're paralleling what we're going through with the high suicide tolls and the major uplifts, and he's actually put his life on the line, hasn't he, defending of human rights. And
when you have a justice system that doesn't defend your basic human rights, you can't get justice. It's like eating a concrete block raw. And so you will only see more and more people committing suicide in hopelessness.
We've been trying to raise up common law practitioners, social justice reporters, legal services online. We've done 70 protests. We've had hui's with the Maori people. But it seems to me that they become combatants, a lot of those who are affected, and they're too traumatized. So we're asking the question, where do we go from here? And it seems to me that this is the next logical step to bring the international human rights lawyer to New Zealand and hold them accountable with the United Nations Tribunal.
Well, the reality is, I do not see anarchy as a really good thing for any country.
Right.
Lawful rebellion, I can understand, and it's part of our Magna Carta. So what we're trying to do here, before this becomes full scale, is go through the legal process and all the options there. Now, the thing is that if we look around, and you politicians and you bureaucrats need
Yeah.
to wake up, because going around the world, we've got whole countries rising up against the abuses of the state in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in Argentina, in Chile, in various Middle Eastern countries like the rising in Egypt, against these corrupt, lawless governments that are not listening to the citizens.
I mean, we've just had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into state childcare abuse and 28 witnesses, and they're not going to actually respond to the report until the 2023. What's that saying? They're not really coming up with any solutions,
Well, I
are
was
they? They're
there
not
with
facing the facts.
I was there with Arthur Taylor yesterday, and
Yeah.
Arthur gave a speech on the fact that, you know, what would his life have been like if his relationship with his biological parents hadn't been cut off because he got sent to a children's home.
Yeah,
And, you know, he's a very clever man.
childhood trauma.
But he basically went to live in a university of crime.
And we know 2/3 of those in prison are Maori people, and they're suffering from childhood trauma. They've actually put that as a reason why they go off the rails.
Well,
And
that would be
so-
understandable because they've been removed from the bond from their parents,
Yeah,
and that's why they join gangs.
and it's become a cash cow at a top level. You're saying that they're not answerable, Oranga Tamariki, the police, and they're just doing these uplifts and they're making a lot of money. He was saying that a person looking after a child in Norway, a foster care parent, gets 100,000 a year. How many billions was it worth a year to the system?
4 billion euros.
I mean, that's absolutely amazing, isn't it? So anyway, having stood for the mayor and the local council, I got about 1,500 votes, and I will be standing for the Justice Party. And we had the Young New Zealand First on TV on Saturday morning, and collectively they want to hold the country responsible for its own future. Okay, so, you know, when you talk about no social justice anymore, no community with the homeless and with the child uplifts and so forth, it seems as though we're in the dark, Steve.
We are.
Yeah.
Listen, there's no democracy in New Zealand. The
Yeah.
fact is they come along and they promise you everything for 6 weeks, and as soon as they're in, they change the rules. I
Yes.
don't care what Winston says. I don't care what Simon Bridges says. And I definitely don't care what Paula Bennett says, considering she used my children in Operation Phantom and you. The bottom line is, how on earth did some of these politicians get into power?
So we want open secret courts, less forced adoptions, every child uplift interview should be recorded, family peers to be present at jury trials, judging on evidence, not presumption. Childcare services should have proper structures to counteract emotional detachment. Okay, so this is from The Fringes for another week. Thank you very much for listening to our show. Let's be agent of law change and let's bring transformation to this country. Okay, bye-bye.
Jesus Christ! But then, drama.
This is Constable Marty Hernandez. He's involuntarily entered the vehicle. This is not an ideal situation, but it is a new situation we have here, and
You alright, Hernandez? You alright?
to be honest, he should have been wearing the vest.